So welcome and please be seated. So ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our university, the Eindhoven University of Technology, and welcome in this blauwe zaal, and I guess it's obvious why this is called the blauwe zaal. Welcome to the inaugural lecture of Heleen de Coninck. Very much looking forward to it. A few months ago, an interesting article appeared in the New York Times. In this article, a group of climate scientists expressed their frustration. They went to such length to get their message across, but felt that no one was listening to them. This is what they said, and they referred to the United Nations Global Warming Summits. We've had 26 conference of parties meetings, for heaven's sake. More scientific reports, another set of charts, and I mean seriously, what difference is that going to make? I'm quoting them, so it's not my quote, it's their quote. The scientists came up with the idea to stop their research, such that nations could take actions on global warming. It didn't work. But they do touch on a relevant issue and ask themselves, and again I quote them, is what we are doing with our lives really making a difference? How can we get elected officials to act on the threats that we have so clearly identified? Do we become activists? End quote. Now Heleen will address this question during her inaugural lecture, and you see the title projected on the screen. She reflects about her own role in the climate debate. But it also shows, I think, the dilemma that many climate scientists faced. Do they show their despair? Or do they show hope? Clearly, time is running out. But why we do anything if there's no hope left? Now, fortunately, Heleen gives us hope. She regularly writes opinion pieces in national newspapers, can be seen on television and heard on the radio about climate action and the climate goals. Each time with a critical message, but one that does express hope that we can still achieve our climate goals. And to quote Heleen herself, so the IPCC report is clear. It is still possible. It gets complicated, but it's possible. So let's do everything that we can do to make it happen. End quote. Now, it's obvious that Heleen is passionate about this important subject already for a long time. Climate change has always been one of her specializations, even when she was a student. After that, she moved to the Max Planck Institute for Chemistry, and she ended up at the Energy Institute, ECN, where she conducted research into international climate policy and capacity building in developing countries. Now, she came to our university via the University of Amsterdam, the VU, and obviously the Radboud University, and I welcome all the people from the other colleague universities today at this inaugural lecture. So I'm very happy and very proud that you became a professor at our university and so active in this field. Dear Heleen, I want to thank you for your critical but positive view on the future. Keep offering hope, but maintain pressure on the system. There's a prophetess, Deborah, and she said already a long time ago, the mountains flowed before the Lord. Today we would say, everything becomes fluid under pressure. So pressure has to be on the system. Thinking beyond today requires a strong vision. So please keep up your fantastic work and continue to surprise us, but also to inspire us. I'm very much looking forward to your lecture.
System change, not climate change. I have climate change activists to thank for the title of this lecture. You can read it on banners, by climate protesters all over the world. System change means different things to different people. Some mean abolishing capitalism. Some mean abolishing patriarchy or neoliberalism, or a combination of those things. And some may not be able to express exactly what they mean with it or what it means. They just want to express that something big and pervasive has to change. And probably the latter is also roughly what it means in the academic literature on systems, transitions, and transformative change. And I'll try to unpack that in this lecture. I started my environmental career as an activist. When I was 11 or 12 years old, I was very worried about acid rain. My parents will remember. I wrote to the newly formed Ministry of the Environment asking for flyers. I cut out photographs and took my parents' typewriter and summarized the contents in short newspapers. They were for any neighbors who were willing to pay for the copying costs. So sort of like an IPCC report avant la lettre. Though, unlike IPCC, my work at the time was not based on the peer-reviewed literature, not reviewed by thousands of experts and governments, and my writings were quite policy prescriptive as well. I recommended that people separate waste, buy organic products, and buy a car with a catalyst to reduce sulfur dioxide emissions. I think at the high point I had like 10 subscribers or so. Fast forward 30 years, 2019, Amsterdam. Friends of the Earth Netherlands, along with many other organizations, organized a climate march. It was cold, it poured all day. Despite this, over 35,000 people from all ages and backgrounds, from all over the country, made it to the Dam Square. I was there, but officially not as a climate protester. I gave a 7-minute mini lecture on the IPCC special report on 1.5 degrees, which was published 6 months earlier. So what did this special report teach us that was compelling enough for the Dam Square? Well, even the IPCC, which tends to stick to reporting without judgments, concluded that there are clear benefits to limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. Or, as the BBC summary of the report was, scientists politely urge, act now, idiots. I started out as an activist, but I changed course to follow an academic path, to follow the truth of science. But sometimes, such as that moment and many moments beyond this, you find the results of your work leading you back to the activists. And that's precisely where the 1.5 degrees report led. The time was clear that the results of this report needed to be heard loudly and clearly. And to be clear, that need is still there. So let's look at what needed to be shared on that day in 2019, before bringing back the focus to today. Remember, the report came out now almost 4 years ago. It was written in response to a request from the countries signing the Paris Agreement of 2015, who wanted to learn more about the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees of global warming. First, the Paris Agreement states that all countries should collectively limit global warming to well below 2 degrees centigrade and strive to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. But what would be the difference between those two seemingly small temperature rises? Is it still possible to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, or is the price too high? The conclusions were very clear, and some of them shook me up quite a bit, especially those from the chapter in which I was actually not that involved, the chapter on impacts. Most conclusions were also confirmed in more recent reports by the IPCC, the 6th assessment report, although some had to be changed. One of those key messages that changed, actually, is that we can still limit warming to 1.5 degrees, but if we continue on the same path, we will exceed it in 2040. That was the conclusion 4 years ago. The outlook is looking worse, based on better analysis and more recent developments. Today, the conclusion is that if nothing changes, we are bound to exceed 1.5 degrees in 2030. A second key message that was shared on the Dam Square that day is that there are clear benefits to limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. If I put it in layman's words, we would be short-sighted fools if we would not try really, really hard to limit warming as much as possible. This conclusion is not only relevant, but perhaps even more important to share today. Therefore, I would like to share with you a couple of examples of these impacts. For instance, at 1.5 degree of warming, about a quarter of the coral reefs in the world would still be left. At 2 degrees of warming, they go essentially extinct. What this means is that there is a clear and present risk that one of the largest and most important marine ecosystems will disappear almost completely. And not only fish and corals are affected by this. It has consequences for people relying on those ecosystems, for their food, for their income, and for tourism. Without the corals, or with the corals, cultures will also disappear. Let's look at the year 2100. Oh, wait a minute, this goes wrong. Okay. And sea level rise. In the long run, every 0.5 degree of warming more or less, is over 1 meter of sea level more in the long run. And even more, the tipping point of irreversible melt of polar land ice might be somewhere between 1.5 and just over 2 degrees. If that point is crossed, and we don't know exactly where that is, sea level would rise more quickly, and we would be looking at potentially even multiple meters by the end of this century. The consequences for low-lying areas are strong. 1.5 degrees will give coastal regions more time to adapt. And what that means is that a lot of human and ecological suffering can be prevented. So we're currently at 1.1 degree of warming, and you are probably already noticing that the climate is changing. We see droughts, we see stronger floods, stronger hurricanes, and also heat waves. This will all worsen significantly beyond current levels as the temperature rises to 1.5 degrees, and disproportionately more after that. At 2 degrees, hundreds of millions of people more may be at risk of poverty already in 2050 compared to 1.5 degrees, and this is mainly because of extreme weather. Because of really good efforts of early warning systems and better disaster responses, people's lives are often saved during these disasters. But it do tend to rob people of their livelihoods, their cattle, or their harvest. At 2 degrees, more birds, insects, fish, and mammals would lose suitable ecosystems. More areas will be uninhabitable for people. So now that the outlook and the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees is clear, let's turn to the BBC's eloquent summary of the report. Act now, idiots. And ask ourselves the question, what does that action actually look like? The conclusion was, and still is today, based on the AR6 of last April as well, that we can still limit warming to 1.5 degrees, but this requires deep and immediate emission reductions all over the world. So the question is, can we do that, and are we willing to do that? And for this, 2 things need to happen. First, global greenhouse gas emissions need to peak in the next couple of years globally. And second, as you see here, CO2 emissions need to be halved by 2030 globally, be net zero by 2050, and go net negative thereafter, meaning we would have to remove large amount of CO2 from the atmosphere. This can still be done, but it is not an easy feat. Emissions have to drop by almost 10% per year globally, and although this also includes countries that have large populations under the poverty line, we should not look to these populations for the fast emission reductions. Those changes need to come from the high consumers, the high emitters. After all, the poor of the world still need to start using more modern energy, consuming more and more nutritious food, getting access to medical care, all kinds of things that in our current systems lead to more greenhouse gas emissions. Fortunately, the AR6 also concluded that eradicating extreme poverty can be achieved without significant global emission growth. That these people are also the ones who are most likely to bear the consequences of climate change makes it even more pertinent that their needs are met, as this will also reduce vulnerability and increase their capacity to adapt to climate change. So it is by now becoming very clear. Something big and pervasive has to change. And before looking further at global solutions, let's take a moment to zoom in to the Netherlands, where we are today. We will soon have a renewed climate law that will follow the European climate law prescribing climate neutrality in 2050. Climate neutrality is generally seen as a balance between greenhouse gas emissions and sources and sinks. As sinks of greenhouse gases are mainly CO2, and we need these sinks to counterbalance the remaining positive emissions, this means that we will have to reach CO2 neutrality in the EU and in the Netherlands well before 2050. Maybe even as early as 2040, as Bernard ter Haar, the chair of an expert team on the Dutch energy system, recently stated. This means net zero CO2 emissions in the Netherlands in the next 20 years. It is becoming increasingly clear that we will not get there by implementing a list of technologies or a list of discrete policy measures. These are all necessary, but more is needed. The changes need to go deeper, and more than our technological setup needs to change. Climate neutrality, rather than halving emissions, needs to become the criterion. Policies need to aim beyond 2030 towards net zero CO2. Again, something big and pervasive has to change. So I've named this lecture System Change, Not Climate Change, and started by telling you that this means different things to different people. And I would like to spend the rest of the lecture explaining what it means to me, because it's important that we all understand such system transitions, and this is what is truly needed to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. So I'll share with you what these system transitions, as we call them in IPCC reports, are, how they can be brought about, and what the challenges are to do this in a just manner. And I will close the lecture with an overview of my own research agenda and some personal reflections. So you may hear system transitions referred to by climate activists as system changes. In the 1.5 degrees report, we call them system transitions. The sixth assessment report says system transformations. I'm not going to go into the definitions. I'm just going to assume it's roughly the same thing. But it does mean for me that multiple attributes of society need to change at the same time and quite drastically. Okay, now you still don't know anything. It sounds very academic, so I'll just share an example to explain what I mean. Looking at electricity, it is currently fairly uncontroversial that moving to a largely renewable electricity system is the way to go. By doing this, we also know that this means more variable and land-intensive technologies, in particular wind and solar energy. We are by now, especially in the Netherlands, also feeling the consequences for the electricity grid. New solar parks cannot be connected anymore in some areas, as the grid operators cannot guarantee grid stability. But there is more to the picture than just technology and infrastructure. A renewable electricity system means that households, people, and neighborhoods are becoming producers as well as consumers of energy, of electricity. And this changes the relationship between people and energy. Their energy awareness grows. And here is where systems change. Business models for companies will change. Electricity companies are reinventing themselves as we speak. It changes the role of the financial sector players and how loans are given for electricity projects. It changes international trade flows and dependencies on materials, and with that, on other countries. It changes the way the government regulates electricity systems. It requires changes in laws, even multiple times as the system transition unfolds. And all this will come at a cost to some, and with benefit to others, making it also a political issue. Vested interests will resist the changes, and will use every trick in the book to slow things down and make the transition look like a bad idea. People and politicians are sensitive to such pressures. We generally don't like change, and especially if we already feel vulnerable. For instance, if we have difficulties making ends meet, or if we feel overwhelmed by other big issues, such as a horrible war nearby. It's getting really complicated now, isn't it? You're probably understanding what I'm getting at when I talk about a system. Engineers often define a system as its technological parts. In electricity, we would include wind turbines, the grid infrastructure, transformation stations, and the like. Social scientists, including many of my colleagues at the Technology, Innovation and Society Group here at Eindhoven University of Technology, include things like social norms and institutional aspects. I am of that school. Please assume that I cast the net quite widely when I say that something is systemic. So such system transitions can go quite quickly, but they will still take time. And in the meantime, climate change is unfolding at a very fast pace. The hard reality is that our countries will never be the same. The Netherlands of harsh winters with ice skating and cool summers with long, rainy days is not coming back. We need to change in order to limit change. And we need to change in order to be able to deal with those changes. Emission reduction and climate change adaptation need to happen at the same time. And adaptation and mitigation used to be separate worlds, but we can no longer afford to do adaptation without reducing emissions. And by the same token, mitigation needs to also increase resilience from now on. And even beyond that, we need to take into account other dynamic changes. Socio-technical developments around digitalization, around planetary boundaries other than climate change, such as nitrogen, and societal needs, such as a reliable government or appropriate housing. So in my example of a system transition using electricity, we should add that this electricity system will need to be resilient in a potentially fast-changing climate. I'm talking significantly higher temperature extremes, changing river runoff levels, which are already affecting hydroelectricity and cooling water for nuclear energy. So in my example of a system, and it has to deal with other technological developments, such as digitalization. This offers opportunities in energy efficiency and the like, but it also offers threats through steep increases in electricity use for data. So in the 1.5 degrees report, we introduced 4 system transitions for mitigation and adaptation in line with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. First, the energy system transition. Second, the land and ecosystem transition. Third, the urban and infrastructure system transition. And fourth, the industrial system transition. And it is true that these 4 systems are interlinked and depend on each other, forming a larger system of itself. So maybe we should look at them all simultaneously, but at the same time, speaking about each one individually makes the solutions more concrete and more tangible. So for now, that's what I'll do. I've already introduced why the electricity system transition is systemic. Another example is the urban and infrastructure transition. In order to have resilient, climate-neutral, and healthy cities, we need to change aspects of urban life, such as transport systems, buildings, water provision and use, and waste management. In mobility, if we view it from an engineering perspective, replacing internal combustion engines with electric vehicles and changing the fueling stations with charging infrastructure is enough. However, owning private cars, as a general rule, demands huge material resources. It is not energy efficient and it clogs up the streets. The mining of lithium and other resources needed for batteries is leading to new environmental and social problems as we speak. So a mobility system transition ought to follow what is in the literature and IPCC report called avoid, shift, improved. First see if the mobility demand can be avoided, then shift to other modes, such as walking, cycling, public transport, and if the trip is unavoidable and no alternative exists, shift to a cleaner mode, such as electric vehicles. And as with the electricity example, all this will mean changes in how we view transporting ourselves. In the car as part of our identity, as a cult symbol, or as a technological fascination. In business models, in government regulation, including how taxation works, in urban planning, in public transport infrastructure, etc. Our food and agricultural systems require similarly large overhauls, and practically all human systems are affected by climate change mitigation and adaptation. And among these, I find the industrial system transition particularly fascinating, as it is such an optimized, locked-in sector that is at the same time crucial for our well-being and progress, and a huge emitter of greenhouse gas emissions. It's very remote to most people, and companies and shareholders are rarely inclined to speak about systemic matters in that sector. And then all these system transitions have profound consequences for justice. My personal motivation, as you may have guessed by now, for working on climate change, and actually a motivation that I share with many climate change activists, is the huge inherent unfairness that the affluent are causing climate change while the poor are hit hardest by the consequences. If we are not careful in these system transitions, the poor will also be the ones hit hardest by responding to climate change. There will be winners and losers, and it's an open question to me whether it's possible that responding to climate change can also address poverty. But at the very least, we should make every effort to ensure that existing inequalities are not exacerbated by responding to climate change. So for everything I just outlined here to happen, the system transitions themselves need to be just. Now, this whole thing, just transitions, is a concept that has emerged from the labor movement. Historical research has revealed much experience, both good and bad, from past transitions, whether it was coal mine closures, change of agricultural systems, or urban reforms. Where change happens, some people lose something. Some people even feel that their regional identity is taken away from them, which is a sentiment still very widespread in the former coal region in Limburg in the Netherlands. And it is that loss of identity and livelihood, of regional pride, that can, at least partly, explain the love for politicians who promise that things will stay the same, for instance, in the United States. Research has also looked at just transitions and has identified maybe 3 or 4 elements of them. First, distributional justice. Second, procedural justice. And third, recognitional, and fourth, restorative justice. Those last 2 are often taken together. I'll say a little bit more about them. But before that, justice also needs somebody to whom it is done. One voice that is quiet, until recently at least, is that of young people, who will have much longer to live with the consequences of a changed climate than middle-aged people like myself or the generations before mine. The youth movement's appeal to intergenerational justice is well-founded. And further, we can extend the justice question to nature and organisms other than humans. Climate change is intimately related to biodiversity, and there's a rich and expanding literature on this relationship. So no matter what, it is clear that solving climate change without improving biodiversity and restoring human nature harmony is a dead end. And there are even more angles to justice. I cannot help it, it just keeps on getting more complicated. Inter-country justice, which this picture illustrates, plays a dominant role in the international climate negotiations. The Paris Agreement is the latest answer to this key issue. But also intra-country justice matters. Many poor countries hide a significant rich and high-emitting population. This is linked to inter-country justice in complex ways, where we attribute emissions and how they are assigned to different countries, also complex, also at times seemingly unfair. And my personal view is that justice and fairness are important enough in their own right. But I'm researching it also for a more pragmatic reason. because not observing them is eventually going to erode support for climate policies. Even if the moral aspects play no role in your mind, there are sound arguments to pay due attention when people are bringing up justice and just transitions. So I hope I made it clear that no matter what we do, change is inevitable. And that these changes will have to be big and pervasive, systemic, as well as just to keep our planet livable and healthy. The question is, how can we make this happen? It obviously does not happen automatically. And how can we make it happen quickly enough? How can we accelerate system transitions? To me, it is very clear that a systemic problem will not have a non-systemic solution. So what are our points of intervention? We cannot innovate ourselves out of climate change, as technology always has a social side. I know that many of us will have already experienced this, most recently in the pandemic, but behavior can change quickly. But changing social norms, such as the norm to own a car or to eat meat, takes more time. And no one has the power to change this by themselves. Investors are not going to change their policies and risk assessments overnight or on their own. Firms may resist change. Some need to completely reinvent themselves or disappear as their core business becomes unattainable. Even governments are not empowered to act alone. They need public support. They need other countries to also act. And they need to know that firms can continue supplying key products, or else chaos follows. In the 1.5 degrees report, we try to make sense of this by identifying 6 enabling conditions that are all needed. I often present them as 6 pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, because you can't lay it without all pieces. However, if we look at all these 6 pieces of the puzzle, there are definitely some favorite pieces for different players. So first, let's start with the most popular one. And I would say that is technological innovation. Most media pick up on the good news. The cost of renewables and electric vehicles are dropping really rapidly over the past 20 years, and deployment is increasing rapidly too. The AR6, by the way, attributes this success to public policy, both policies for innovation and for deployment. But the report warns against technology optimism. Rebound effects, where savings in one space lead to emissions in another, can be significant, so the drop in emissions is not as clear. Developing countries benefit less from technology than developed countries and emerging economies. Renewables and batteries lead to new environmental and social problems as a result of mining in areas where human and environmental rights are not necessarily protected. Innovation tends to exacerbate rather than reduce inequalities, leading to questionable justice performance. And this is also why I have a little bit of a love-hate relationship with technologies such as carbon dioxide capture and storage and removal. They tend to be liked by those who think we can innovate our way out of climate change. And I know we need such technologies, but I also see the risk of reducing on them too much. So no matter how tempting it is to believe in technology, it would be short-sighted to exclusively rely on it. It needs to be combined with other enabling conditions, and it needs to be just. So second, the other enabler that is very obvious is policy instruments, and this refers to every measure that government takes to influence climate change. For mitigation, governments can price emissions, but this is not enough. It can regulate, including prohibiting polluting or dangerous activities. It can educate, it can subsidize, and it can influence transitions through green procurement and clear leadership. There is barely anyone denying the crucial role of government anymore, even when it seems to move slowly at times. So third, I mentioned behavior earlier. This enabler is gaining some prominence lately. It was also mentioned in the AR6, which concluded that emissions could be reduced, theoretically, by 40 to 70% in 2050 through widespread behavior change and reducing demand. But there is more to behavior than this. It also includes public support for technology and voter behavior, which determines how ambitious government will be and how just their policies. Fourth, finance is another enabler, although currently the financial sector acts more like a barrier to systems transitions. The AR6 concluded that more investments are still going to fossil fuels globally than to mitigation and adaptation combined. It is a sector of its own with a very particular dynamic. It consists of many different types of players, such as commercial banks, central banks, insurers, pension funds, development banks, rating agencies. And financial crises have shown that the financial system is a very dynamic system, which can spin out of control. Once it starts to move, it can move quickly. When we wrote together with the Green Climate Fund a summary for financial decision makers of the 1.5 degrees report, one banker we met mentioned what he called the herd mentality of the financial system. If one goes and has a success, all of them go. And this feature, which was actually disastrous in the context of the financial crisis, can perhaps be turned into an advantage for making the financial system an accelerator of systems transitions. The fifth enabling condition is multi-level governance, how different levels of government and other actors work together. All actors need to be aligned to accelerate systems transitions in the private and the public sector. In banks, every imaginable worker, everyone has a possibility to act in their own way. And to align these actors, more collaboration and less inefficient competition is needed. This is particularly complicated internationally. As I've worked a lot on this, allow me to take a little bit of an aside to go through the quarter-century of history of international climate change governance. The topic is very close to my heart. I started working on it at the Energy Research Center of the Netherlands in 2002. It was the topic of my own PhD thesis, and I still work on it here in Eindhoven with PhD candidates Clara and also Wolfgang. So the role of international cooperation and governance has changed very strongly. In the 1990s, when international climate change governance started in earnest, treaties were strong and the international community was relatively united. The Kyoto Protocol was agreed in 1997 and had some pretty significant instruments, such as the Clean Development Mechanism for developing countries. It worked at least partially. But it quickly became clear that this model was not viable in a changing world. The United States, then the largest emitter, never ratified. My PhD thesis in 2009 was on the role of technology in the climate negotiations. Internationally agreed emission reduction targets would never find support from large countries such as the US and China. And after the failed Copenhagen COP, a technology mechanism was set up under the UN climate negotiations, but operations have been very limited so far. So this Paris Agreement of 2015 took a path very different from the Kyoto Protocol. Countries submit their own plans. There's no top-down regime, depending on what they feel they can contribute. And although current policies still lead to about 3 degrees of warming, so way more than the 1.5 degree limit that I talked about earlier, it is sort of working. At least countries are committing to stronger emission reduction targets because of peer pressure and new, more dire climate change impacts that are unfolding. The technology discussions are a bit of a sideshow in the Paris Agreement, I have to be quite honest about that, and also in the media. But this obscures one very important point in the Paris Compromise. In order for developing countries, especially the poor ones, with negligible emissions, to commit to these mitigation plans, developed countries would have to provide the means of implementation that would allow these countries to do mitigation and adaptation. These means of implementation are 3: finance, technology, and capacity. Finance from developed to developing countries is falling short, as we saw very clearly during the last COP in Glasgow. And the technology mechanism under the UNFCCC is very weak. And this brings us back to the enabling conditions. The sixth one, and by far the area with the least investment, is capacity building. Despite that, it is very clear that we need people who are well educated, who are climate and technology literate, and have the skills to make the right decisions. We are barely helping countries where the situation is much worse than here, with capacity support. All countries need engineers. I don't have to convince you of that here in this auditorium. but also policymakers who know what to do. We need skilled facilitators for citizen assemblies, for procedurally just public engagement. And we need them not just in developed countries, where there's already a shortage, but we need them all over the world. In conclusion, I would like to talk about my research agenda. Although better with every government, current Dutch climate policy is still largely stuck in the enabling conditions of innovation and policy instruments, and primarily aimed at the 2030 emission goals. I hope I made it clear that we need all enabling conditions to focus on accelerating system transitions towards net zero CO2 emissions in or just after 2040 in the Netherlands. And I hope to contribute what I can as an academic. So there's this saying about not seeing the forest through the trees. As a climate researcher, I have concluded that in order to keep our trees, the best approach I can take is to look at the entire forest. Therefore, my research agenda is intentionally very broad. I look at the forest, the system, and I like collaborating with those who look at individual trees. My central hypothesis is, that mutually reinforcing, enabling conditions can accelerate system transitions. I take courage from that, as transitions can run away. They can move quickly, and more quickly than we think. And this may give us a shot at limiting warming to 1.5 degrees, but we need to be very smart about it. I take inspiration from colleagues Vincent de Coninck and Floor Alkemade, who have introduced me to the system dynamics world. A giant on whose shoulders we all stand is Donella Meadows, who argued that intervention points can set things in motion and can bring about the tipping points that could be the system transition accelerators. And my aim is to work on understanding these interventions and to make sure that the right actors are aware of the much greater possibilities that we have. And with Mara Hauk, Arjan Kirkels, Johanna Höfken, Prapti Mahajan, and Vincent de Coninck and Floor Alkemade, and helped by historian of technology Frank Veraert, we have formed a project group which tries to look at enabling conditions as intervention points, so that they can reinforce each other in a dynamic and a just way. Again, I think this is our best shot at limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. And in particular, I will work with policy instruments, innovation, finance and capacity building in the international context. Finance is a new theme for me here, a system transition all in itself, and with Peter Pauw and several others, I hope to take a systemic perspective on the question of financial system change. So I hope to continue the work on the energy and industry system transitions with Vincent, Mark Huibrechts, Steve Hansen, Moises Covarrubias, Sarah Gornella, Kiana de Kleine, and Floris Svennehuis, as well as many others in both companies and industrial clusters. The climate-friendly materials platform, hosted by DIW in Germany and Climate Strategies in the UK, with Karsten Neuhoff, Timo Gerres, and many others, is also a source of inspiration. And I really hope to strengthen links with the technical and business administration departments at this university, and also with IRES, the Energy Institute. And with Stefan Bakker, the first PhD candidate I supervised, and now at the KIM Netherlands Institute for Transport Policy Analysis, Floor Alkemade, Auke Hoekstra, Hans Jekel, and others at TUE and the NEON Research Project, I hope to collaborate more on the mobility transition. With Aro Revi, Chandni Singh, and Marjolein Haasnoot, we're trying to break down the barriers between mitigation and adaptation in the Netherlands and in the IPCC. I also hope to continue and strengthen the international cooperation research. There is so much more potential in innovation cooperation, also for capacity building. And I hope to continue working on this with TUE colleagues, with PhD candidates Clara and Wolfgang, and with my technology buddies all over the world, notably Ambush, Gabrielle, Sarah Treerup, Harald Winkler, and Britta Renkamp. And I'm glad that the TUE has a Technology for Global Development initiative, which signals that I've come to the right place for this. So finally, working on accelerating system transitions also means something for the research world itself. When I moved from the very applied and impact-driven research institute, ECN, to academia almost on the dot 10 years ago, I was confronted with a challenge that our university structures and incentives pose to academics who want to be policy relevant. It's a struggle to work together with the people who are actually doing the transition work, such as policymakers, engineers in companies, project developers, and community workers. There's just no time for such collaborative work, and there are no incentive to spend hard-acquired research funds on own hours, so you can actually spend time yourself on this. So I was really thrilled to be asked to chair a task force by NWO and the Royal Dutch Academy of Sciences on setting up a climate research initiative in the Netherlands. We called it Klimaatonderzoek Initiatief Nederland, KIN. Steve, thanks for the name, which was launched today. It forms a fairly radical departure from the current competitive, more publication-driven way of doing research towards a mission-driven, collaborative model. And I'm convinced that this is needed. And I'm encouraged by the fruitful and pleasant collaboration within the task force and the warm reception by NWO and KNAW. KIN, we hope, will be operating with a core goal to accelerate systems transitions for both mitigation and adaptation. And it has a significant international program to build capacity in a selection of low-income countries. And I really look forward to contributing further to make this the success that the system transitions need. So as a final question today, it may be worth asking this very simple question: am I an activist? Am I still an activist? I'm a researcher now, but a researcher who sees it as their duty to use research to make this world a better place, both socially and environmentally. Does that make me an activist? I once heard a colleague working on combating Parkinson call himself an activist. He is combating a disease. If I would say that, I would immediately disqualify myself as a scientist, because in climate change, if you call yourself an activist, you're not scientific anymore. If I say it's still possible to limit warming to 1.5 degrees because we haven't exhausted the possibilities yet, there's a very clear need, and really, we never seriously tried. I see it as my duty to stay hopeful, to at least keep temperature rise as low as possible. Does saying that make me an activist? I don't know, and it's probably in the eye of the beholder. So there's a plea to all of you. As I'm trying to play a constructive and science-based role in this debate, please continue telling me if I have become too activist, or if I'm not activist enough. This is for sure something I will continue to ponder in the years to come. So finally, a couple of words of thanks. There's a huge amount of people to thank. Colleagues, friends, family, who've been kind to me and showed me around in life. I have no time to mention all of them, only a small fraction. But a couple of them have been sort of the enabling conditions in my life. During my studies of chemistry and environmental science, Koos Willemse and Irene Dankelman had a big impact. Irene was the one whose contacts invited me to the Grupo de Estudios Ambientales in Mexico City for a master's research project, which was a life-changing experience. And Koos Willemse taught a course on atmospheric chemistry. I was the only student. Very uncomfortable for both him and me. But in that classroom, my fascination with the atmosphere and with climate change really began. Koos was also my university supervisor during my research thesis at the Max Planck Institute in Mainz, where I had a great time and met many friends, some of whom, Karel and Roland, are no longer with us. So at ECN Policy Studies, my first position in climate policy, where I stayed for over 10 years, I really matured as a researcher. Remco Ibema was the best manager, that I could wish for. He was a real stimulus and also facilitated that I could do a PhD next to my work at ECN. And during that part-time PhD at the Vrije Universiteit, my promoter, Frans Berghout, taught me how to be a social scientist. And I still appreciate all the time he invested in me. And during that time, and also during my stay at Princeton University with Rob Sokolov, I got a taste of what research in a stimulating environment could be like. So thank you both. At Radboud University, I would like to thank Mark Huibrechts and also Stan Giele for supporting me at a moment that I really needed it. Working with Mark means being on one's tiptoes all the time, but in a very human and humoristic way. And there are some special PhD candidates that have accompanied me, initially as students in the first full-blown edition of the Energy and Climate course, and now as colleagues. Thank you, Kiana and Floris, I don't know where you are, for your companionship and everything I could learn from you. A big boon of being in the IPCC is the many interesting and inspiring people one meets over the years. For an impact-driven researcher, the IPCC is really like a gold mine of role models. I could mention many of them, but Bert Metz I want to mention in particular. His unrelenting focus on content and his drive to always make a difference has been an example for me for 20 years now. At the moment at TU Eindhoven, in the TIS group and with IRES, I'm again very fortunate to work with colleagues doing fascinating work, such as Floor Alkemade, who by the way is also a great group chair, Richard van der Zande, Henny Romein, and many other colleagues, as well as fantastic PhD candidates, Clara, Vera, Prof.dr, Emil and Wolfgang, and many others. So this lecture is about work, so I will not bore you by dwelling on friends and family too much. They know who they are, and I know how thankful I am that they have accompanied me during different phases in my life, from high school, university, in Mainz, ECN, Nijmegen, and in other walks of life. And finally, my family. My welcoming American in-laws have really enriched my life with Appalachian culture and kindness, and gave me a whole new appreciation of tomatoes. My parents are not climate activists, but they have always supported me and laid the basis for my moral compass and my hunger for knowledge. And my siblings, Leon, Betty, and Harm, it's wonderful to be able to rely on family in all our diversity. This is very important for me, so thank you for putting up with my climate single-mindedness. And finally, my closest family, my partner Forrest, the most loving support and critic I could wish for, and to our daughter Mies, who's outside. The future is hers. Ik heb gezegd. I can see you're all glad it's over.